We now present For the Record.
Welcome to For the Record. I'm Will Keneally. We're a little more than 2 weeks out from that April 1st spring election, and at the top of the ballot, the state Supreme Court race. And this week, we saw the first and only debate in that contest. We'll have a full breakdown of that race in a second, including more on the money being spent to elect the next justice. Later in the program as well, we'll look into the statewide constitutional amendment referendum that will appear on everyone's ballot. But we start with the race for state Supreme Court. The candidates met for that first and only time at Marquette Law School in a debate hosted by a Milwaukee TV station, WISN.
The stakes are huge. I don't know they could be bigger.
Those high stakes played out during a debate that at times turned testy.
I've never been involved in anything where the stakes were bigger than this. And if you told me 5 years ago the Wisconsin Supreme Court would be going through a political agenda, I would have said you're crazy.
The two candidates running for state Supreme Court trading barbs over the direction the court is heading.
You know, he is paying good lip service to the principles of impartiality and open-mindedness. But throughout this campaign, he has taken issues on cases pending before the Wisconsin Supreme Court.
That court was present during the debate Wednesday night, taking a front row view of the candidates competing to replace retiring Justice Ann Walsh Bradley. The court has handled recent important cases like the future of abortion.
My 23-year-old daughter doesn't have the same rights that I do. And what I want for her and what I want for Judge Schimmel's daughters is the same thing. I don't want them to lie bleeding on a hospital bed while their doctors are huddled in another room trying to decide if they're close enough to death.
And we treasure life even when it's not planned. But judges don't make the law. As a judge, no judge or justice should be deciding this issue for the voters of Wisconsin.
In cases like redrawing the state's legislative districts, a case to redraw Wisconsin's congressional districts could appear before the court soon, and conservatives are alleging Crawford has prejudged a case to redraw those congressional districts.
They're going to do the same thing with the congressional maps. And that's why those billionaire donors started kicking in. Almost 50% of my opponent's donors can't vote in the state of Wisconsin because they don't reside here.
You know, I have support from all over the country, and it is because Elon Schimmel is trying to buy this race, and people are very upset about that.
That hour-long debate in Milwaukee will be the only time voters get to see the two candidates meet face-to-face. Now, afterward, the venue also hosted a post-debate spin room. Now, for the Schimmel campaign, former Lieutenant Governor Rebecca Kleefisch spoke, as well as sitting conservative Justice Rebecca Bradley.
Look at the record of my colleagues. I will point you to footnote 2 of my concurrence in Evers v. Markline, where I laid out how they have invariably voted every single case in recent times for the Democrat Party or for the governor, who's part of the Democratic Party, or for his administration, never once against them. And I don't mean to put it in partisan terms, but it struck me when I realized what was happening. So that's what you're going to get more of if Susan Crawford is elected.
Now, appearing after the debate beside Susan Crawford are the 4 liberal justices on the bench. Among them, Justice Ann Walsh Bradley, the longest tenured jurist on the court. Now it's her seat that the two candidates are vying for. We spoke with the justice shortly after the debate. We have 2 sitting judges right now. How did you think the candidates handled themselves tonight?
Well, I think being impartial and not biased, I think that Susan Crawford hit it out of the park. That's what I think.
Acknowledging, too, that you're, backing her.
That's right. I have endorsed her because I think she best exemplifies the kind of justice that the people of Wisconsin not only want but deserve. Fair, impartial, hardworking, keen intellect, understands what it means to be a person of this state with the values that represent this state. Her background sets her apart from her opponent. So I'm excited to endorse her.
So we saw all 7 of you sit in that front row.
Yes.
It's the first time I think I've seen you all get together for a debate like this. What was that like?
Well, we sat in the order that we sit on the bench. So it was nothing all that remarkable to be sitting in that fashion. What was remarkable, though, is that we were all there present for the debate of this campaign.
So we saw things, get certainly a little heated as debates do, but we saw some comments directed towards you as sitting justices. Do you think those are fair charges? What do you make of that?
Well, and I heard some of the comments after the debate also, and I think to myself, I've been on the court for 30 years, and most of the time of those 30 years, I've been generally in the dissent. That's a lot of dissenting voice for 30 years. And so I can understand that some of my colleagues find their newfound role a little uncomfortable. What went on in the debate, though, I think was spurious charges by Brad Schimmel attacking our court. I think that it is, and I have great concern. Not long ago, he said of me and 3 of my colleagues, essentially that as women, he was referring to the 4 of us, and we're all women, that we are too emotional to sit on some cases, and that it makes us unfit to sit as justices of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And I bristled at that. I bristled at that because it turns back the pages of progress that women have fought so hard to maintain over decades upon decades. In 1875, a young woman came before the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Lavinia Goodell was her name. And she wanted to be a lawyer, but she was a woman, right? And you know what the Supreme Court in 1876 then said in their decision? They said exactly what Brad Schimmel was saying today. The justice who wrote that opinion said, there are many employments not unfit for the female character, but the practice of law for women is not one of those employments, because women are unfit. And why? The opinion said because of their emotional impulses. Exactly what Brad Schimmel was saying well over 100 years later, right? 150 years later. And that opinion also said that women are subject to sympathetic disposition and are not fit. That's exactly what he said about 4 of us on the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And I say to Brad, you should know better than that. Anyway, you can guess I was a little unhappy with that, right?
Curious too, regardless of the person, do you have any advice or any particular characteristics that you'd want to see of the justice that replaces you on the bench?
Yes, someone who is keen intellect. Check. Susan Crawford. Someone who understands the plight of so many people in this state. Check. Susan Crawford. A person whose background is based on a fair and impartial, not partisan. You know, I grew up in this job when I was elected 30 years ago. I had strong bipartisan support. Tony Earl and Sue Ann Thompson, for heaven's sakes, were my co-chairs. Every time I ran, I had strong bipartisan support. And I say that we don't need a partisan politician like Brad Schimmel on the Wisconsin Supreme Court.
Our conversation there with retiring Justice Ann Walsh Bradley. When we come back, we take a look at the money impacting the state Supreme Court race with NYU expert Douglas Keith. And later, Brenna Goddard with the UW's State Democracy Research Initiative breaks down the constitutional amendment that would require photo IDs for voting. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back. The race for Wisconsin Supreme Court this spring will break all kinds of fundraising metrics. Right now, WisPolitics.com is tracking nearly $59 million spent in this election, and that eclipses the $56 million WisPolitics estimates was spent in the previous state Supreme Court race. Now, for more on the impact of this money, we're joined by Douglas Keith, Senior Counsel for the NYU Brennan Center Judiciary Program. I want to start here. How have these local Supreme Court races changed over recent years?
Yeah, so state Supreme Court elections have changed remarkably over the last few years. They used to be pretty quiet affairs in most states, but as there's been a growing recognition that these courts are going to increasingly decide some of the highest stakes and highest profile legal cases today, their elections are looking more and more like any other statewide election for a political office. And so you see more money, you see messaging that looks like a US Senate race, for example, and generally you see national attention that these races just didn't used to get.
So, how do our Wisconsin races here compare to other states?
For better or worse, the Wisconsin Supreme Court elections have been something of the tip of the spear when it comes to the increasing politics around state Supreme Courts. The 2023 Wisconsin Supreme Court election was not just the most expensive judicial election ever, it was record shattering. It was more than twice what any state Supreme Court election had ever seen in terms of the amount of money in the race. And this year could break that record once again. But there really isn't another state that has come close in its elections, even in this new hyper political environment.
So, I'm also trying to reconcile this idea that these candidates, they're supposed to be judges with a certain amount of apoliticism, but they also have to run for these seats as politicians. How does that impact these races?
State Supreme Court justices are supposed to be doing something different than the raw politics that the other branches are doing. They're not supposed to be deciding cases because of political pressure or because of deal making. They are supposed to be deciding cases based on what they think the law is or the law requires. And so trying to pressure using political ads a state Supreme Court justice into making a particular decision is very different than calling up a member of the legislature to try to get them to vote a certain way on a bill. It's just not supposed to be how judicial decision making works.
Do we have any insight into who is spending in these races?
One of the reasons that we think outside groups have really gotten interested in spending in state Supreme Court elections is because, in part, they are low information elections. Voters don't know a lot about judges or how judicial decision making works. And the candidates themselves often don't have that much money. You know, that's not always the case, but in a lot of races they don't. And so these outside groups with a smaller amount of money than they might need to spend in another election can really dominate the airwaves and really be the only thing that voters hear when it comes to a race. And so in state Supreme Court elections, these outside groups we've seen, they can account for as much as half, three quarters of all the money in an election. And they can do that with a smaller dollar amount than they might need to if they were trying to influence a gubernatorial election, for example.
Now, among that spending, do we have a sense of how that breaks down on a partisan level at all?
So historically, compared to other states, Wisconsin has been unique in that the money has been relatively evenly split between groups on the left and groups on the right. What we tended to see across the country was a lot more money coming in from groups on the right, recognizing how important state Supreme Courts were to passing their policy priorities. But again, that's something that's changing right now with a growing recognition across the political spectrum for how important these courts are and the high profile cases they're going to be asked to decide. We're seeing in more and more states a situation in which groups on the left and right are spending similar amounts of money.
We've also seen Elon Musk weigh in on this race, which, at least in my mind, brings a certain level of celebrity to this race. Do we have a sense of what kind of impact that might have?
We'll see how voters respond to that. Certainly, these races are getting more and more national attention, and Elon Musk's involvement and his group's involvement are one illustration of that. But they are not the only group spending money in this election. You know, there are other groups on the right that have spent more money than the groups affiliated with Elon Musk that have been spending in Wisconsin Supreme Court elections for many years. And so the introduction of large amounts of outside non-transparent spending is not new in Wisconsin judicial elections. What might be new is this level of national attention that the race is getting.
Douglas Keith, thank you. When we come back, we take a look at the constitutional amendment question on this spring's ballot. UW Law School's Brenna Gadar joins us right after this. Welcome back. On the April 1st ballot will be the chance for Wisconsin voters to weigh in on a change to the state's constitution. If voters approve that ballot measure, it would enshrine photo ID requirements for voting in the state's constitution. Joining us now is Brenna Gadar, an attorney with the State Democracy Research Initiative at the UW Law School, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, it's a bit of a convoluted process to amend the Wisconsin Constitution. Are you able to walk us through that process a little bit here?
Yes, so amendments are initially proposed by the state legislature, and it has to pass both houses of the legislature. And if it does that, then it still has to go through that process again in the subsequent legislative term. So basically, to get on the ballot before voters, the amendment has to pass both houses in 2 subsequent sessions. And then it goes to voters who have an up-down vote on the ballot. If a majority of voters approve the amendment, then it goes into the Constitution. And it's important to know that the governor actually isn't a part of that process. The governor can't veto constitutional amendments.
And this is the only time that Wisconsin voters can directly weigh in on a matter of law, right?
That's correct. Some states have more direct democracy. So voters can actually propose amendments themselves, circulate petitions, and get things on the ballot without having to go through the legislature. But in Wisconsin, that is not an option yet.
We have this photo ID requirement for voting in state law already. What's the difference to enshrine this instead in the state constitution?
So we already have voter ID requirements in state law. The big difference is if you put a requirement in the Constitution, it becomes much more difficult to change down the road. And so there's 2 possible ways that the current voter ID law could be changed. One is by a subsequent legislature changing those requirements. Another is via a court challenge. So if somebody were to bring a new challenge to the voter ID law in state court, there is the possibility that the court could overturn the law on some ground that is already in our Constitution. But it becomes much more difficult for a court to do that if the requirement is in the Constitution itself. And similarly, if the requirement is in the Constitution itself, the legislature can't just walk it back with a later law. They would instead need to go through this amendment process again to make significant changes to that provision.
Do you have a sense of how many other states may have placed similar requirements in their state constitutions?
Yeah, so it's actually pretty rare for states to put voter ID requirements in their state constitution. Voter ID laws are relatively common. There's about 36 states that have some type of voter ID requirement. They vary in how strict they are, and Wisconsin's is one of the more strict voter ID requirements. But in terms of putting that into actual constitutions, there are only 5 states that have a voter ID requirement of some form in their state constitution. And then Nevada voters also approved a similar constitutional amendment in 2024, but they would need to do so again in 2026 for that to take effect. And then Michigan also has a provision about voter ID, but it's actually on the opposite side of this. So the provision prohibits lawmakers from imposing a strict photo ID requirement. But for the most part, this is something that we see legislators doing through state statutes. Like we currently have, as opposed to putting this in the Constitution, which is more rigid and more difficult to adapt to changing needs later on.
Now, spring elections in Wisconsin here are traditionally low turnout, and it's that age-old question, but do you have a sense of whether this may energize voters to get to the polls this spring?
I think it's hard to say. I haven't seen a lot of publicity around this issue, actually. I haven't seen as much in terms of yard signs or campaigning as I have in some other campaigns like in Minnesota around voter ID. Minnesota was actually one of the, I think, the only state to actually vote down a voter ID amendment that appeared on the ballot. And there was a really large, prominent campaign. And we just haven't seen sort of that same level of attention being paid to the voter ID amendment. So it's hard to say whether that will be a primary turnout driver or if it'll really just be the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, which we're seeing a lot more publicity around.
So I also want to ask too, is there anything that you want to parse for voters as they're heading into the voting booth on what this amendment would practically do?
I think the really important thing to know is that we already do have a voter ID requirement in state law, and that is not going to go away whether or not this passes. So it could be changed down the road, definitely, and done so through the regular lawmaking process. But the really important thing that this constitutional amendment would do, the biggest change it would make, is it would just make it more difficult to make changes to the existing voter ID law. So this isn't just asking voters, do you want a voter ID requirement? We already have that requirement. It's asking more specifically, do you want that to be in the Constitution? Or do you want that to be something that has more flexibility that other legislatures can change how strict the requirement is, or make more changes to it down the road.
Brenna Goddard, thank you so much. And we'll be right back after this. Welcome back. The Wisconsin legislature will continue their work next week, meeting for a couple of different floor sessions. Now, they're expected to approve a bill requiring county sheriffs to check the immigration status of those arrested for felonies. Another bill would bar trans athletes from participating in women's sports. Both, though, would ultimately need to be signed by Governor Evers. That does it for us this week. I'm Will Keneally. Have a great rest of your weekend.
This has been For the Record.